What's up, folks? Welcome back to the office. It is December 1st. November is behind us, and I'm about to analyze some trail camera data that I collected throughout the months of October and November in Iowa. So I had 12 cameras on a mix of public and private ground. All of these cameras were on scrape locations. Keep that in mind when I'm analyzing this data. If you're running cameras on food sources, travel corridors, pinch points, rut funnels, you might get a different result than I have here. If you haven't seen previous content we've done with Steve Sherk in Pennsylvania, he ran a trail camera study for our 2020, 2021, 150 trail cameras in the big woods of PA, public land, and he took daylight buck photos, all daylight buck photos for that day, tallied them up, compared them to the weather to see what impacted daylight buck activity. So this isn't just mature bucks. This is all daylight buck activity. So what I did here on this spreadsheet, I took the high temperature for the day, the low temperature for the day, wind speed, the amount of daylight that day, and then I tallied up the amount of daylight buck activity. One of the things that intrigued me the most about doing this study and keeping this data was I wanted to measure how the weather impacted daylight buck activity in a low pressure state compared to a high pressure state like Pennsylvania. Apples to oranges here, Pennsylvania to Iowa. Does the weather play as big of a role in a low pressure state? And what I found was it definitely does. So we can start diving down into the spreadsheet. You can see for the first week or so in October, we have highs in the 70s, and then we have lows in the mid to high 40s. And then we do get a significant temperature drop from October 6th to October 7th. We're dropping 12 degrees here. The big thing I want to point out, though, is the low temperatures. They go from 44 to 28. And as a result, you can see we go from 0 photos, 1, 0 to 3, starting to pick up a little bit, 4, and then 10. So we get a spike in activity on that first decent cold front in October. Everyone knows you get cold front in October, bucks are going to move. The data shows that. What I want to point out too is once you get that cold snap, you get this 28 degree day, this 28 degree morning, and the activity lingers. So the next day it's 73 for a high, but you still have 6 daylight photos that day because that activity stuck around. As the temperature starts to steadily increase, daylight buck activity shuts back down. So 75 degrees, 67, 68, and we're moving down to 4, 5, 0 daylight buck pictures. Now, one thing I want to point out is that October 11th and 12th, you have a 50 degree low to a 38 degree low. So you are getting a cold front here, but the wind speed is jumping from 18 degrees for an average that day to 31 degrees as an average that day. And that absolutely killed the daylight buck activity. The following day, we have 68 degrees to 50. So you have an 18 degree temp drop, still 30 mile an hour winds, and you get a spike in activity. So the cold front, cold weather trumped the high winds that day. October 14th, again, lows below freezing, just like Steve says. Boom, spike in activity. Now, one thing that was interesting to me was how the weather started to become stagnant and the daylight buck activity also became stagnant. So October 15th here, 59 and 27, you only had 2 daylight photos that day. That could also have something to do with increased hunting pressure. That could have something to do with food sources switching, that scrape shutting down. There's a bunch of other factors here, but I thought it was interesting that the weather kind of became stagnant and the activity also kind of started to shut down. You can also see here during this stretch, 31 mile an hour winds, 30, 25, 21, 26, 24, really high winds throughout this week here. As we move down in the spreadsheet here, you can see the temperatures steadily start to drop after that stagnant weather, 53, 43, 47. You get these low temperatures, 26, 23, 16, and you can see that daylight buck activity starts to pick up and it sticks around. 8 photos, 11 photos, 13, 12, 13 photos. But as I stated before, you get that 28 degree morning. You get that 16 degree morning. These bucks are starting to get fired up. Look at the amount of daylight on October 19th. You're below 11 hours of daylight. It's 83 degrees on October 21st. You have 13 daylight photos. That's because that morning On October 21st, the low was 28. The amount of daylight, 10 hours and 53 minutes. You get those wind speeds are starting to die down, and you get a spike in activity. Once that 28-degree day kind of passed, that 28-degree morning passed, you get 28, and then it goes up to 39, then 52, then 59, then 46. Look at these daylight activity. 3 photos, 1 photo, 1 photo. The cold front of all October cold fronts hit for us on October 25th. The temperature dropped nearly 40 degrees in one day. You had nearly an inch of rain on October 24th. October 25th, 20 daylight buck photos. Like a switch, from 1 photo to the best day in October. I was in the woods that day, and I saw 12 different bucks from the tree. It was just an absolutely incredible day. Moving down here, weather kind of warms up a tad, 7 photos. This is where the biggest difference came from Pennsylvania studies to this study, and that is the warm weather. So you have above average temperatures for a high October 27th through November 4th, I'll say. You have an average temperature there. You have an average temperature there of 66 degrees, above average. I cut my trip short. I was out there hunting, and I went home. But look at the daylight activity throughout these days. An average of 66 degrees from October 28th. Actually, let me go to October 28th through November 4th. You have an average of 67 degrees for a high. You have an average of 40 degrees for a low. So you're not below freezing. Average daylight activity in that stretch, 11 daylight photos. So double-digit daylight photos, even with above average temperatures. That's where the big difference came for me. I went home. I said, the warm weather is going to shut these deer down. They're going to rut, but it's going to be at night. But I was flat out wrong. You saw it with Steve's data. The warm weather shut them down. Here, the activity never really shut down until you got a low temperature of 52 and a high of 72. So you didn't have a big fluctuation in temperature. You had a little bit more wind. You had 3 daylight photos that day. And then November 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, temperatures starting to drop. And look at this stretch of daylight activity, 16, 19, 9, 22, 18. The best day I had on trail camera in Iowa, November 7th. November 7th is Bill Winke's favorite day. He hunts in Iowa. If it's November 7th, you got to be in the woods. That's what I learned. 57 degrees, 38 for a low. It doesn't matter. 22 daylight photos that day, 18 daylight photos the next day, 58 for a high, 35 for a low. Now, here's where things get a little bit interesting as well. November 9th, November 10th, 76, 72. The temperature does start to drop on November 10th. You get 8 daylight photos and 6 daylight photos. Comparably, the activity was kind of slow, but you still have a really good chance at shooting a buck when it's 76 degrees on November 9th in Iowa, because we had 8 daylight photos on 12 cameras, so the bucks were still moving. Then we get into another super big cold front. The temperature drops 40 degrees from November 10th to November 11th. Wind speeds pick up to 20 miles an hour as an average. The daylight buck activity just blows up. 16 photos on the 11th, 15 photos on the 12th, 14 on the 13th, 13 on the 14th. November 14th was an absolutely amazing day. I got a shot at the buck that I was in a tree stand for. It was a non-fatal shot. Terrible luck, deflected off a limb, hit the buck, but not fatal. November 15th, I did not hunt because I had an arrow in a deer. I was waiting to have a dog come in. November 15th was the absolute craziest day, and we had 14 daylight photos that day. After that day, I started to kind of take some cameras down. Obviously, super upset because I just had wounded a really, really nice deer, and I was planning on going home. November 16th, we had 4 daylight photos, but I would imagine that if all the cameras were deployed, it would have been a little bit more. So the activity never really shut down for me all the way through the month of October. From October 28th through, let's just call it November 15th, when I had all the cameras deployed, we had an average of 13 daylight photos. And before that, we had an average of 5 daylight photos. Although the average temperatures were higher throughout that stretch, the daylight buck activity didn't seem to hinder. Now, I don't have data to compare to a colder October and a colder first week in November to see if these daylight buck activity goes from 17 to 30. But the point being here, if you are in a low pressure situation with a high buck density, maybe the weather doesn't have as great of an impact as it would in a lower buck density, high pressure state like Pennsylvania. The conclusion that I'm drawing from this information is if I'm in the Midwest and it's November and I only have a week to hunt, I'm still going to be in the tree, especially in those mornings when those low temperatures are below freezing, or those when it's really warm in that day, but those low temperatures still below 40. The mornings are where it's at throughout a warm November. Another thing that kind of surprised me throughout this data was how the scraping activity never really seemed to die down. Like I said, all these cameras were on scrapes, and the activity in those areas on those scrapes never really seemed to die down, whereas typically you would see that mid to late October be the best time for a scrape, starting to peter out November 3rd, 4th, 5th to November 6th through November 12th. It seems like your scraping activity kind of dries up. I didn't get that same result here with these cameras, and I think that's just due to the amount of bucks in the high buck density area that I was in. Thank you guys. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, and hope you guys had a great November.